Hello, everybody, and welcome to Episode 7 of the Battle of the Rappahannock custom multiplayer game. In Part 6, we covered the turns between 2 p.m. and 3:40 p.m. We saw Sickles advancing west of the river against the Confederate left flank. And over in the east, we saw Hill and Ewell begin their attack against Reynolds' Grand Division. We are now at the 4 p.m. staff meetings. These are the first open discussions the sides have had since 2 p.m., and the last discussions they'll have until 6 p.m. For the 4 p.m. Union discussion, the Federal Army was now hard-pressed in the east. Reynolds was being attacked heavily, as well as Sykes, who was being forced back along the Rappahannock River northward. For the Federals, it was time to change things. The momentum was going against them, and nothing was going right at the moment. Hooker asked his generals for their input, and not surprisingly, it was Reynolds who spoke up first. The current status of my command is extremely tenuous. With Sykes' withdrawal from Wheatley's Ford, my situation certainly won't improve. Whether those rebels move against Meade or attack my flank remains to be seen. I don't need any more of them here. I am seeing brigades from both Ewell and Hill continuing the attack. What goes unmentioned is the amount of rebel cavalry which has been employed against me this past day. I intend to fight it out, if not on this line, then in this general area, to the death. Reynolds suggested recalling Meade's force from Tin Pot Ford and bringing them back to shore up Sykes' defenses on Reynolds' flank. Reynolds suggested that Sickles would have more than enough force to drive on the rebels west of the river, even without Meade, but help was badly needed in the east at once. After some more discussion, the 4 p.m. Union orders were issued. Meade would fall back over Tin Pot Ford to the east and begin moving to reinforce Sykes' troubled division. Sickles would move all of his forces for Brandy Station and abandon any drive on Culpeper as being impractical given the current situation on the battlefield. Reynolds was to keep fighting and attempt to make it until nightfall, when he might be able to entrench and receive reinforcements from either Meade or possibly Sickles. The 4 p.m. rebel discussions. Lee feels good about Anderson's positions and feels confident he can hold until nightfall unless strongly pushed by Sickles in the Beasley Woods. General Anderson will continue to delay and fall back before Sickles' juggernaut for as long as possible. This battle really comes down to Anderson's corps avoiding serious damage, while Hill and Ewell destroy Reynolds and Hancock. Lee felt there was little to discuss overall. Ewell and Hill would continue their attacks against Reynolds, while Anderson fought against Sickles. Hill would keep attacking with Pender in support of Ewell, while Rhodes used part of his division to continue the attack on Sykes, who was now felt would break without much more of a fight. The stiffer resistance being put up by Reynolds now made it apparent that the Federals intended to fight at Morrisville. We put in an attack straight off the order of march in order to try to keep the momentum going, and that was the right thing to do. We weren't certain how determined the Yanks would be to defend Morrisville, and now we know. They will be tough to beat in a frontal attack. That's fine. Let's see how supple those people are. Where brute force doesn't work, maneuver will. The attack would continue, but the emphasis would begin to shift to outflanking the Federals from Morrisville. So my unasked for 2 cents about the plans that both sides are discussing. Well, really both sides had good discussions during this period. Reynolds desperately needs help right now, and Meade is the only one who can reach him. And so for Meade to fall back over the river makes perfect sense. The real question is, can he reach him in time? And I think that's what we need to watch over the next few hours. If Meade delays or is stopped, can Reynolds continue to hold without any reinforcements from the rest of the army? And it's critical now more than ever because the rebels are now moving for his flanks. And if they do that, eventually they're going to find a point along his long line which is less defended, and they're going to be able to break through. So will Meade be enough? Well, even if all of Meade's forces came to the eastern side of the Rappahannock River, it would bring up the federal force to about 33,000 infantry, 6,500 cavalrymen, and 144 guns. And that's a best-case scenario. On the other hand, the Confederates have 34,000 infantry east of the river, 7,000 cavalrymen, and 142 guns. So the pressure remains on the Federals east of the Rappahannock River, and not only that, it's going to take them hours to even reach their positions. Best case scenario, if Meade can go to the east, he might be there by nightfall. Can Reynolds continue to hold that long? We'll have to wait and see. At the 4 p.m. turn now, and Meade has began to move to the east. He's getting his forces in the column and is making towards Tin Pot Ford. Just in case you're curious about this lone unit that's been sitting over here, it's actually the 90th Pennsylvania. They were left behind during the earlier fighting on that part of the battlefield. They just happened to occupy a hex completely out of sight of the Confederate forces, and they're now just sort of stranded behind the Confederate lines. Over in the far east, Hampton has been pushed. So far in this battle, he's been making a lot of headway, but that has finally come to an end. And let's zoom in on that area of the battlefield. So here you can see that Hampton's forces have run up against numerous Federal cavalry brigades, along with the Federal infantry brigade. Altogether, there's about 2,500 Federal infantry, 5,300 cavalry, and 9 artillery pieces. The Confederates have about 3,300 cavalry and 8 artillery pieces against them. For the Federals, switching to the offensive from the defensive is not an easy thing to do, but they've managed to do it pretty well so far, and they're beginning to work their way around the Confederate flank. For the Confederates of Hampton's division, their momentum has carried them as far as they can go. They aren't able to make any more headway against this Federal resistance, and now they're actually being pushed back. Sickles is adding more men to the fight. The battle in Beasley's Woods is about to commence, and the Confederates have been slow to fall back out of those woods and allow the Federals to really mass against their lines. And so I think we're going to have a battle in these woods if the Confederates aren't careful. Whether or not the Confederates are going to fall back after a token resistance, or if they're actually planning to fight in those woods, remains to be seen. 4:20 p.m., and there's a lot of action across this battlefield, all the way from the western side to the eastern side. And the Federals had driven back McLaws from the Beasley's Woods. And this isn't really that surprising, because when the Federals struck, they hit Martin's Green E-rated Confederate brigade, and they quickly routed. And in the process, the Federals captured 7 guns in the Beasley's Woods. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens now that the entire right flank of McLaws's line has caved in. Over on the other side of the river, the Confederate attack against Sykes' division has driven them back as well, and they are now fleeing back through the woods towards Tin Pot Ford. Over to the far eastern side of the map, Hampton is also falling back. His right flank has been threatened, and he is beginning to pull back towards the south. 4:40 p.m., and the fighting in the west continues. Sickles' right flank is driving against the rebels along the turnpike and pushing them back. In Beasley's Woods, McLaws is trying to hold back a flood of Federal troops at this moment. There's over 16,000 Federals pushing against him, and he's only got about 6,000 men to confront them with. Along the Rappahannock River, Sykes is being overwhelmed right now. Going up against 3 of Rhodes's brigades, he really doesn't have a chance. His one organized brigade is already falling back, leaving just remnants of another brigade to try and delay the Confederates. Over in the east, there is heavy fighting going on between Reynolds and the forces of Ewell and Hill. A large Confederate attack has been launched against Reynolds' lines, and they are trying to push them back from their defenses around Morrisville. The Federals did spike some of their guns rather than allow them to be captured, so the Federals are looking for ways to minimize their point losses, and that is smart. And the Federals are also condensing their lines as much as possible along Reynolds' front. They don't have a lot of reserves left, and so they're just looking for ways to hold on just a little bit longer. And we're actually going to zoom in on that part of the field right now and take a closer look. Reynolds' Grand Division generally has the 1st Corps on the left and the 2nd Corps on the right. And as you can see, Reynolds has formed this long salient around Morrisville with his flanks stretched farther to the north to try to hold back the Confederate cavalry. For the Confederates, Ewell's Corps has 2 divisions just up against the 1st Corps position, while A.P. Hill has Pender's division against the 2nd Corps, along with 2 detached brigades from Rhodes's division attacking from the west. Hampton's cavalrymen are up in the northeast, trying to reach the road behind Reynolds' flank, while another detachment of cavalry has moved against Reynolds' other flank, trying to cut the road from the opposite direction. So far, they've been unsuccessful, as the Federals have always had just enough men to stop the Confederate attack. I believe the Confederates overlooked an opportunity here in order to really put the squeeze on Reynolds from another perspective. About an hour ago, Gordon's large and mostly unbloodied brigade were moving to the north, east of this large patch of woods here. And instead of just moving to the north and joining with Hampton or maybe trying to outflank the Federal 1st Corps, they turned to the west and rejoined Ewell's main body in their attack against the 1st Corps. And it made me think, well, what if they had just kept marching north? They could have easily struck the Federal line where it is weakest and more than likely driven right through their line and forced the Federals to close their gap on their northern side, effectively surrounding them. The Confederates then could have stretched their lines and completely surrounded Reynolds' Grand Division, but that didn't happen, and Gordon marched instead to rejoin Ewell's main body. So now we're going to have to see what the result of that is. Reynolds dodged a bullet there, but how much longer can he hold? We have reached a milestone in this game as the Confederates are now 50% of the way to their loss limit. For the Federals, they are at 61% of their way to their loss limit. Looking at the order of battle and the casualties, feel free to hit pause if you'd like to look at this more, but the Federals have lost 12,753 men so far in the battle. The majority of these losses come from both Hooker's Grand Division and Reynolds' Grand Division, which have lost nearly about 6,000 men each. For the Confederate side, they've lost just under 8,000 total men, with the majority of their point losses coming from really the 49 guns that they've lost, but also the 2,300 cavalrymen that they've lost in the battle. 5 p.m. now, and McLaws versus Sickles. This battle is getting more and more heated as the Federals are working their way around the rebel left flank. Meade now has 3 brigades east of the river, and they are moving south to reinforce Sykes' position. And because they are no longer needed to fight against Sykes, Hill has been able to detach a large force of cavalry, which are now heading to the east to reinforce the attack against Reynolds' position. And Ewell is now stretching to his right flank in an attempt to spread the attack along the Federal lines and look for a weak point farther to the east. Meanwhile, the Federal cavalry has actually looped behind Hampton's right flank and are now in a position to maybe isolate and cut them off from the retreat southward. 5:20 p.m. and McLaws is in some serious trouble now. The Federals have successfully worked their way around his flank and are causing all sorts of problems. And let's zoom in on that area. We are now looking at Beasley's Woods, and the Confederates of McLaws' division are being pushed back from all sides. The Federals have 2 divisions of both the 3rd and 6th Corps attacking them, and they are just pouring in from the north, from the northeast, and the northwest. And most importantly, they've worked their way around the Confederate left and have flanked them. They have isolated these units here, and there are now about 900 Confederates which are going to surrender more than likely during the next turn as a result. As you can tell, McLaws needs to find a way to get out of here as fast as possible. Otherwise, he could be looking at some more major losses before he's able to extricate himself from the Beasley's Woods. Rhodes versus Meade. It feels like Rhodes is now kind of pulling back from his advance along the Rappahannock River, and he's actually sent a brigade northward, I think, to try to figure out whether or not the Federals are coming around his right flank. Pender and Ewell repulsed. The Confederate attack along Reynolds' lines has failed. The Confederates took heavy losses and really a lot of routes in their attack against Reynolds' position. And although they were repulsed, you know what? The Federal line is really thin right now. There are almost no reserves that Reynolds has to plug any holes, and he's been very fortunate this turn that the Confederates were really beaten back with heavy losses, so it's probably bought him some more time. Over in the east, Hampton is falling back. He now realizes the situation that he is in, and he has spotted the Federals looping around his right flank. Already, the Confederate horse artillery is retreating southward, and Hampton's offensive has completely come to an end. 5:40 p.m. now, and there's been a lot of Union success over in the west, and let's take a look at it. Zooming in, on this part of the battlefield, we have Sickles' Grand Division attacking the scattered elements of McLaws' division. Altogether, there are about 28,000 Federals attacking 10,000 Confederates along this part of the field. And the Federals are still largely combat ready and fresh. They haven't been heavily engaged, and when they are, they're getting the better of the situation. For the Confederates, they find themselves increasingly fatigued, disrupted, or routed on the battlefield as the Federals bring fresh waves against them. And really, this situation was made a lot worse when Martin's brigade of E-rated troops was attacked and routed on McLaws' right flank. The Confederates have never been able to recover from that rout, and those troops are practically useless now. This has caused McLaws no small problem, as the Federals have continued to attack on both of his flanks and along his entire line. The Confederates need to find a way to extricate themselves, or they're going to be looking at a major disaster on this part of the battlefield. During the last turn, the Federals lost Brigadier General Joseph Carr when he was captured leading an attack on the Confederate lines, and the Confederates lost Brigadier General Paul Sims, who was wounded in the fighting. Over in the east, Reynolds continues to hold on, but just barely. Ewell's forces and Hill's forces are still pressing up against his lines, but Reynolds has successfully repulsed them each time so far. So we are now at the end of the 5:40 p.m. turn, and it's time for my unasked for 2 cents about what we've seen over the last 2 hours. Well, what we've seen is a major momentum swing in this battle. During the 4 p.m. turn, things were really looking bad for the Federal Army. The Federals had lost 6,189 points, and the Confederates just 4,333 points. That meant that the Confederates were 43% of the way to their loss limit, while the Federals were 54% of the way to their loss limit. But now, at 5:40 p.m., things have really shifted. The Confederates have lost 6,504 total points, which is an increase of almost 2,200 points since 4 o'clock. For the Federals, they are now at 7,957 points, a gain of about 1,750 since the 4 o'clock hour. And what that means is the Confederates have gained 22 percentage points and are now at 65% of their limit in the game. While for the Federals, they've gained also, but they've gained fewer points. They've gained 15 percentage points since the 4 o'clock turn, and they're now at 69% of the way to their limit. So the gap between the two sides has closed rapidly in the past 2 hours. And this is definitely good news for the Federals, as they had to find a way to even up the battle and get back into the contest. And they really have done that over the last 2 hours. And how did that even happen? What went on here? Well, McLaws didn't follow the plan. The retreat to Brandy Station never happened, and I feel like I've said this numerous times over the last few videos, that McLaws needed to be more careful than he was on the left flank of the Confederate army. And instead of just fighting a withdrawal, he fought a full battle in the Beasley's Woods, and he's paying the price for that. Kershaw should have stayed at Brandy Station. I remember when they were sent northward, I began to question what they were trying to accomplish. And so far, the only thing they've accomplished is getting themselves into a mess. Kershaw's lost about a third of his brigade in a very short time, and they might lose more. I think reinforcing McLaws with Kershaw's brigade was the wrong move. It gave them too many men, and it gave them a false sense of confidence that they could hold against the Federals longer than they actually could. And now they're paying the price. Over in the east, Ewell and Hill were repulsed by Reynolds, and the losses have been heavy in the attacks against Reynolds' lines. And I think they were smart attacks, and I think they were the right moves to make, but unfortunately they haven't worked out so far. But that's not to say that they haven't been effective in wearing down the Federals, and maybe they'll eventually be able to break through as a result of all these continued attacks against the Federal lines. And then in the far east, we saw Hampton's division get repulsed on the flank of the Federal Army. And that was really a great opportunity by the Confederates to get in behind Reynolds and wreak havoc all along the Federal lines. Unfortunately for the Confederates, it just didn't work out as they planned. On the Federal side, well, what happened? Well, Reynolds has put up a spirited defense. All along his lines, he has played this game masterfully. Despite being outnumbered and pushed hard, the line continues to hold. And I think that's really a credit to the generalship of Reynolds at this point, where he has managed to counter the Confederates each time they attacked. How much longer he can continue to do this remains to be seen. But as of now, Reynolds is fighting the fight of his life. Sickles has also been really aggressive on the opposite flank, and he's taken the fight to McLaws as much as possible. And because of this, they've been able to gain a lot of points on the Confederates by isolating, capturing, and beating the heck out of McLaws' scattered elements. And the Federals have been trying also to minimize their point losses wherever possible. And that is a smart thing to do, whether it means spiking guns to cut the point loss in half when they're captured, or if it means falling back rather than taking a chance. The Federals have been making some smart moves over the last few hours in order to minimize any point loss possibilities. Can things go on like this? Well, the rebels of Hill and Ewell, they still have strong forces, but they are suffering from fatigue at this point, and they're pretty disorganized. But the Yankees don't know this, and when they're holding their lines, all they see is more and more and more Confederates coming at them, and it's got to be really taxing on their psyche to see just an unending stream of Confederates seemingly coming through these woods at them. Reynolds, though, is equally worn out from a full day of fighting, and he has fewer and fewer units available to fill holes when they occur. But again, the rebels don't know this. So neither side knows that the other is having problems, and both kind of feel that the other side is getting an upper hand, and this all has to do with fog of war. Sometimes we get so focused on what's going on with our lines, we forget that the enemy has their own problems. But eventually, something has to give. We've got two combatants just beating the heck out of each other between Reynolds and Ewell and Hill, and something will eventually have to give. Which side that is remains to be seen. What am I looking forward to in the next part? Well, will the rebels press the issue against Reynolds before nightfall? They've had a lot of losses. Things seem to be going against them. Are they going to throw in the towel and wait for night and regroup for tomorrow? Or are they going to keep attacking and hope to break through before nightfall? And can it get worse for McLaws? He's taken a lot of losses, and his position is really precarious right now. Is he going to be able to extract himself? I'm really curious about that. Meade and the 5th Corps. Meade has brought back most of his forces east of the Rappahannock River, and whether or not those forces are able to draw off Confederates from the attack on Reynolds remains to be seen. All right, everybody, thank you for watching. It's been an exciting episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. There's a lot of things going on the battlefield right now, and things are really heating up. So the next episode should be just as exciting. I will see you then. Take care.